Alright, so I've got a few other things in the works, including a pretty big piece on difficulty in games, and I'm looking forward to playing Far Cry 5 and letting you know what I think about that. But today, we're going to talk about the recent Presidential Commission on Violent Video Games. After the recent shooting in Parkland, there was seemingly some political will, at least within the population, to move forward in some sensible gun control. Listen, I don't have much of an opinion on that, really. I think that the Second Amendment was clearly intended to pertain to having an easily armed and ready militia force, but on the other hand, it was written by people who knew that the European monarchical prohibition on an armed peasantry surely weakened any revolutionary activity that may have taken root there. The myth of the egalitarianism of our founding fathers is just that, but there's no denying that most were fierce anti-monarchists and believed that the power of the state needed to be kept in check by the citizenry. But on the other hand, I'm also positive that they were talking about average people keeping a rifle or two that would be used for pheasant hunting and could be pressed into military service when the state had need. None of those highly interesting arguments matter anymore, however, because in 2008, the Supreme Court ruled that the Second Amendment was about a personal right to bear arms, invalidating over 30 years of gun control laws. Suddenly, the vast majority of gun regulation was unconstitutional. If the Constitution was speaking of a personal right to bear arms, well then, no act of Congress can abridge that. Not only did this open the floodgates to more gun ownership, it opened the floodgates to lawsuits challenging nearly every gun regulation on the books across the states. Each time a mass shooting has happened since then, the nation has had the same discussion about guns, and very little of it has been of any actual value. Liberals have argued for a litany of gun regulations that wouldn't have prevented any of the tragedies they were responding to, and conservatives have reflexively and steadfastly refused to listen to the vast majority of citizens, including their own constituents, who want some reasonable regulations on who can own powerful and deadly weapons, what they can do with them, and where they can take them. The United States has, by far, the highest rate of gun ownership in the world. It has nearly double the amount of guns as the next highest nation. For every 100 citizens in America, there are approximately 101 guns. For comparison, Serbia is second at 58.2. When you add that to the lack of a universal healthcare system, a mental healthcare system that was devastated and destroyed in the Reagan administration, and a critical lack of mental health care beds, you get the recipe for tragedy. Any serious look at the epidemic of mass shootings in this country would need to focus on the availability of guns, the availability of high-powered, high-magazine capacity long guns, a creaky background check system, and a miserable failure of the country's healthcare system, especially the mental healthcare system. But even at the best of times, politics is the business of framing debates, and these are not the best of times. When citizens demand that something be done, and what needs doing is working through a pile of problems that are politically divisive and that powerful, moneyed interests do not benefit from solving, what's a politician to do? Divert attention to something else. After initially seeming to support some gun control legislation, even going so far as to lecture congressmen of his own party about being afraid of the NRA, in which he ironically was speaking to the one member of the Republican caucus who has stood up to the NRA and Pat Toomey, President Trump began to hedge, and finally to start talking about the role that violent video games and movies have had in the explosion of mass shootings. To find the answer to this question, he had a panel discussion. The panel featured 3 soulless, stuffed suit politicians, the CEOs of ZeniMax and Take-Two, who published the original Moral Panic game of Doom, and the always controversial GTA respectively, the leader of a group whose sole mission is counteracting what they see as the degenerate morals of Hollywood, and a man who has written an anti-gaming screed that is based on nothing more than seemingly his gut. Not invited to the party were any of the people who've actually studied this issue. And there have been studies of violence in video games. Plenty of them. Almost all of which showed that violent video games have no effect on behavior. After the meeting, the White House uploaded a 1.5-minute montage of gory violence from video games like Fallout, Call of Duty, Sniper Elite, Wolfenstein 2, and more. This was gore porn from games, completely without context. Exactly the kind of thing to get parents all upset and citizens riled up. But what even counts as violence in games? Most games feature violence. You kill enemies in almost every game, from Skylanders to Doom. Is it only gory games? Does it only count shooting? Is it only killing human enemies that matters? Or is the violence against Goombas and Mario putting our children at risk as well? Is Dark Souls okay? What about horror games? Even taking a moment to think this through makes plain how absurd it is. Is Call of Duty more likely to cause violence than watching The Walking Dead? The people who repeatedly peddle this like to say that video games are an active media, but video games are not that immersive, and as someone who has shot guns before, I can promise you, video game guns and real-world guns have nothing in common. But there's more. Not only is this entire premise ridiculous on its face, it is also a pointless waste of time, because the government has less power to regulate violence in video games than it does to regulate guns. That's because the Supreme Court has also recently weighed in on video games and said they are a form of free expression protected by the First Amendment. That's the one before the Second Amendment. Even if video games could have some kind of indirect effect on the likelihood of a kid becoming a shooter, and again, even saying that out loud makes it clear how completely ridiculous that is, there is nothing that can be done. Video games, even violent ones, are protected as free expression. And violent video games happen to be the most popular and best-selling video games, so companies have no incentive to lessen the violence. Video games and movies can certainly affect us, but the myth that games create some kind of blood rage in kids is absurd. I could as easily argue that violent video games lead to less violence because they serve as a safe outlet for violent fantasies. Most violent games contextualize their violence in the same way that films and television shows do. They aren't just gory kill fests where you disembowel enemies every 3 seconds and bathe in their blood. They are usually stories, and from the dawn of time, art and stories have dealt with violence, because most interesting art is about the extremes of the human condition. The Iliad and the Bible are blood-soaked tales of violence. Our greatest national myths and legends are about violence. The tales we love of our shared cultural heritage in the Old West is almost always about violence. We have a military that spends millions of dollars on advertisements and film and games and TV partnerships to contextualize or mythologize the reason and methods surrounding the violence they are tasked with doing in our name. People are violent by nature, and those with mental illness or little to no connection to others don't need video games to show them the way. They have TV and movies and books and advertisements and magazines and the news and their own imaginations. Violence is everywhere. Exposure to violence is everywhere. The only difference with games is that it's a new art form and therefore suspect to those that don't understand them. But the same thing was said about television when it was invented, and film before that, and radio before that. Even books were considered dangerous. The 1980s, when I grew up, featured fear of satanic cults and kids driven mad by heavy metal music. This was an actual political discussion in our country, with Tipper Gore going on an anti-metal crusade, and congressmen literally holding committee meetings looking into whether metal music was damaging our children and leading to suicide and murders in satanic rituals. It is deeply disturbing that people with actual power would spend even 5 minutes examining whether video games or heavy metal or violent movies are leading to mass shootings. And that's because we don't need politicians or even scientists to help us with this question. There's a much easier, more logical way to figure this out. Every country on Earth plays these games. Even a tiny, meaningless channel like mine has views from dozens and dozens of countries, but no other country has even close to our level of mass shootings. So what's the difference? If we all play these violent games, that obviously isn't the factor leading to the bloodshed. So let's break it down real quick. There are 2 things that must be present for a mass shooting to occur: a gun and a crazy person to wield it. We aren't the only Western country to play violent video games, but we are the only major Western country with a patchwork, for-profit mental health care system. We're also the only country with 101 guns for every 100 citizens. Listen, every problem in every country is solvable if you're willing to make the trade-offs. Particularly difficult political problems like gun regulation require genuine, realistic discussions about the costs and benefits of action and inaction. Perhaps Americans are willing to tolerate mass shootings in exchange for the liberty of unfettered access to guns and the lower taxes provided by our useless healthcare system. That's a legitimate point of view, and a good place to start a reasonable and logical discussion of the issue. Maybe they'd be willing to have higher taxes and access to only a few types of small magazine long guns in exchange for a lower possibility of these shootings, or maybe they'd fall somewhere in between. But it's impossible to discover what people want if our leaders can't even bring themselves to look the populace in the face and honestly discuss the root causes of these problems. Video games have no impact on this problem. If they did, we would not be the only country experiencing these shootings at such an unbelievable frequency. Or we could just do this same ineffectual song and dance again the next time. It seems to me that people in power, if they honestly gave two fucks about stopping mass shootings, would be working day and night to figure out a way to have less untreated crazy people walking around. They'd be having committee meetings to figure out a constitutional way to make it much harder for those same people to get any guns at all. And they'd be making it very difficult to get assault weapons or high-capacity magazines. Anything else they talk about is utter bullshit. A way to divert attention from the actual difficult problems that need fixing. Or they're actually stupid, which is more possible than it's comfortable to believe. Cynicism or stupidity. Take your pick. Alright, thanks.